Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Corban Collective Show. I'm your host, Scott Johnson. Today's episode, we're going to have a conversation with Nick Stumbo, who is the Executive Director of Pure Desire Ministries. Now, I reached out to Nick. He's based out of Oregon, so I kind of wired up a East Coast, West Coast conversation so we can talk about something that not many people want to talk about. And here's the topic. We're talking about pornography. We're talking about sexual addiction. We're talking about moving forward in our lives to this kind of very private sin that manifests in a very public way. Now, let's face it, guys, you may be wanting to turn or hit the next button, find another video to watch. Let me just say this. I know right now there is a war being fought and waged against your heart and your mind and is being attacked through your eyes in the way that we see the world around us, especially through sexuality and a lot of things. So we need to have this conversation at least to provide an atmosphere where we can actually say, here's some resources that we can move forward. Pure Desire Ministries is one of those. I want to make you aware of them, so we're going to start the conversation now. Hey guys, I want to welcome to the show a special guest we have today. Nick Stumbo is going to be joining us, and he is the Executive Director of Pure Desire Ministries. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to Nick, and so that he can tell you about himself and let you know a little bit more about Pure Desire. So, hey Nick, glad to have you.
Yeah, thanks for including me, and it's always great to be invited. For anyone who's not real familiar with Pure Desire, it was started by a guy named Ted Roberts about 25 years ago when he was pastoring a church outside of Portland, Oregon, and just saw the level of sexual brokenness in the community and the world around him. And he said, if I'm going to reach people, I need to reach where they're broken, and that's in their sexuality. And so they started a groups-based ministry for men and women to find healing and hope and freedom, and did something very, very unique in that he went to a secular resource, Dr. Patrick Carnes, who is doing kind of the leading research on sexual addiction, brought that research into a biblical foundation and created a healing system that has just created incredible transformation for so many men and women. And so for the last 4 years now, I've had the privilege of coming in and leading this team to try to help more men and women find freedom from these struggles that can be so addictive.
Well, Nick, I'm glad that you're with us, man. And this is a really big issue, and I'm glad that we can use this topic or this video today to kind of jump into this. Obviously, with this series, we're talking about kind of these three areas of where men have been called and tasked to lead. First, we've been talking about self-leadership, and that's really about followership and leading ourselves to the well every day, and to be led by the Spirit and to live in the Spirit, so that we can lead in our homes. And but we're talking today, and I've got you on to talk about that third ring, the community. Now, this is I love that we're pairing up these two issues: community and public facing side of community, and sexual issues, and just especially about purity and impurity. Because usually we don't like for those two things to meet. Right? We try to keep some things kind of to the side. We like to keep it personal, keep it in the home. Don't take it outside. But let's talk about this for a minute, because when you and I were kind of doing some show prep, you mentioned something that was very crucial. That there is a tendency to not want to. I'll use a phrase, go public or be in community in that vulnerable space with issues that are so personal. And I will say, and I'll just go ahead and say prevalent. They're not, it's personal and prevalent. We know this. So Nick, I'm just going to step aside and let you speak into that for a minute.
Yeah, it definitely is an area that it feels private. It is personal. It can involve some things that we're not real comfortable sharing with a whole group of other people. And so the message we can get is, well, if I am struggling, I need to figure out a way to fix this on my own. And sometimes that's reinforced by our culture because we don't talk about it, particularly in Christian circles.
Yeah.
We kind of put the smiley face on, I'm doing fine and I'm okay. And what can happen for us if we're struggling, we look around at everybody else and it seems like Everyone else is doing fine. They have it figured out, but there's something wrong with me.
Right.
And really, that's the voice of shame that keeps us in isolation, because in the belief that there's something wrong with me, I go home and on my own try harder to stop a behavior, to make better choices. But what happens when I'm separated from other men is I am blind to the pattern that I'm stuck in. I'm blind to the voice of shame, and I'm blind to all of the factors that are contributing to the choices I make. So it's
Mhm.
not just that I make a bad choice and I look at pornography or I act out in some way sexually, but it's a whole host of other things that are happening in my life. And what we have found is those other factors are at their root, they're relational. That
Yeah.
our wounding in life is from relationships. The voice of shame in our life is relational in nature. And so the idea that I can go into my own cave of isolation and fix it by myself
Yeah.
is actually kind of humorous, because the very issues that need to be fixed are about other people. And so we need deep and committed engagement with other people to really process through these things that are keeping us stuck.
Now, Nick, how does Pure Desire, what's the methodology of helping take something that's personal and private and helping guys move into that arena of accountability and community? What does that look like for you guys?
Yeah. Well, as I was sharing a little bit about our history, we have just found that outside of a group setting, for someone to find healing by just trying harder on their own is nearly impossible. And so, from the very beginning, Pure Desire has been gathering men and women, because women struggle too, but gathering people into a small group environment where they're committed to one another, and going far beyond our traditional ideas of accountability, because accountability in the way most people do it is really broken. It's saying to somebody else, hey, will you check on me and ask me how I'm doing?
Right.
Which basically means I've just given you responsibility for my change, and it's up to you to check on me. That's not going to accomplish much for us. In a Pure Desire group, we're really taking someone through a process of change that involves everything from learning how to be an honest truth teller, learning how to tell your full story, understanding the cycle of addiction that you've gotten stuck in. What are all the steps you take along the way? Recognizing what are the wounds and trauma that you may be reacting to. What does the voice of shame sound like? And how do we embrace God's truth in our life? Because really, the healing is through Christ, it's through what He tells us. But we have to get to a place where we can receive those words, because we've identified the lies and the shame that often block us from hearing truth and living out that truth. So, the groups that we run for men and for women are typically about 10 months long. And for a lot of people, they feel like, well, that's ridiculous. Shouldn't we just, 4 or 5 weeks, we nail this and get it figured out? But the truth is, we're talking about making some deep, lasting brain change. And that's not something that happens quickly. We really need a committed group environment where we can sustain change long enough that it becomes permanent. And so that's one of the things we talk about a lot, is that we want our healing to be full and final. We don't want to just keep trying a little harder to do it less. We want to actually walk in freedom. And that's one of the great things we see, is that when people engage at this level, they say, I'm not just doing better, I'm free. I'm free
Yeah.
of what used to enslave me so often.
I find it interesting, especially living in a culture right now where, especially on the internet, there's so many um, experts and coaches and everything. Well, it seems, especially like our area of physical fitness, it seems so natural to say, I need to be a part of that movement. I need to be a part. I mean, you look at the Peloton, people are paying thousands of dollars for an
Yeah.
exercise bike in their living room. Just they're paying for the community aspect. That's they're putting a high dollar ticket on community. You can ride your bike. You can ride a bike in your living room,
Anywhere. Yeah.
but the high price that people are willing to pay is for community. But the irony of that is, when we leave the realm of physical fitness and spiritual sickness, or spiritual and sexual purity, what's that number one stumbling block, or that, I guess, I don't know, what's that hurdle that keeps people from reaching out to Nick, or going on to puredesire.org and taking their first step? What do you see the first the major obstacles?
Yeah, when I hear a question like that, I often think of like a rope of three strands, because I think nearly every
Right.
man I know that's faced this issue is dealing with some level of rationalization, minimization, and denial. So I rationalize the problem. It's not that big of a deal. And I minimize it. Well, everybody struggles. And I deny, well, it's not really that big of a problem. I can stop when I want. And what often happens, those three lies that we listen to can keep us stuck in our behavior until it gets to a point where it's unavoidable. It surfaces in the marriage and it's starting to blow things up. It leads to something outside the marriage.
Yeah.
And now there's careers on the line or losing our family. I mean, that's when someone would, at that point, like, I would do anything to change it. But the
Sure.
problem we face is that up until that moment, so many of us are listening to these voices that say, no, no, I've got it under control. I can handle it. And the truth is, every man thinks that right up to the moment when he can't handle it anymore. And so part of it is an honest self-assessment to look inside and say, I can't handle this on my own. And I need to stop lying to myself and be willing to open up to others and say, I'm looking for help here. And then that's where, kind of covering those three lies is that voice of shame, where we do fear that if I were to admit to Scott that I'm not as holy or perfect as I've kind of led him to believe, and I tell him about my struggles with pornography or the things I'm doing online, he will think less of me. And we're so fearful of that feeling of being diminished or being seen as less than,
Yeah.
that we'd rather act like things are okay. But the truth is, as we keep putting on that show and that front, we don't get better. We just have to perpetuate that performance lifestyle. And so it's coming to a point of just saying, you know what, it's not worth living in this isolation of my own shame and frustration when I know it's just an act. And I really want help. And that's what we were made for. We were made for one another, to be there to encourage and to strengthen and to lift up. And so if I'm struggling, I need you, but I also need to be aware that you need me. That just because I'm struggling doesn't mean I can't be someone that encourages you in the places you're struggling. So
Right.
that's the other thing I think we do as men. We kind of put us into groups of like haves and have-nots. It's the guys that have it figured out and the guys that don't. And we want to feel like we're included in the guys that have it figured out. So we
Yeah.
don't want to admit our problems and be in the guys that don't. When the truth is, none of us do. We all need each other. We're all in the same boat. And no matter how good or perfect we look, we got stuff, we got issues. And if we
Yeah,
could come
man.
to that point of saying we're in this together, then we can mutually encourage and strengthen one another.
I always like to say we're all dragging a wagon of something.
That's right.
Everybody.
Absolutely.
I want to underscore something you said. I asked a question about obstacles, and you redefined it in a very helpful term. You said they're not obstacles, they're lies. And I want to just drill on that for just a moment, because I believe that we're believing the lies of Satan more than the truth of God. And I think that's part of what kind of holds men captive, is that the lies of Satan are so loud at times that it drowns out the truth and the voice of God. And I said obstacle, and I do want to drill in that for just a second, because you said that there were lies that we're listening and we're telling ourselves. Where do you see that working out in the ministry at Pure Desire? And y'all speak to that directly.
Yeah. Let me try to paint a picture of it. And it's something I could talk for an hour about. So I'll try to condense it into like a 1-minute thought here. But
Sure.
what happens for all of us is that early in life, we have negative experiences that communicate to us about our value, identity, or worth, and a negative message. And those become planted in our thinking in a place we call the limbic system. The limbic system, our inner brain that's responsible for survival. And that's where we get fight, flight, or freeze reactions to protect ourselves. But it's interesting when it comes to our identity and to things related to sex, we can have those lies rooted at a limbic level. And what that means is our brain is holding on to these experiences in order to protect us. And because they're there to protect us, we have these automatic negative thoughts, these lies that are coming that we don't have to work on. And that's why, I think every one of us has had that experience when we wake up, maybe it's a Monday morning, and our brain is just going, I feel terrible. I'm not good enough. I don't have what it takes. Just over and over. And you don't have to even try to think those things. They're just coming. And that's because they're rooted in our soul in places of shame and pain and woundedness. So what happens then if we're a Christ follower is we try to quote a verse at it, or we try to remember a positive experience, but that's something we have to proactively do. And so that's the dynamic we talk a lot about at Pure Desire, that if we're not proactively incorporating God's truth into our life experientially, And that's where relationships are so vital, because it's through relationship that I really experience the love of God. It's through relationship with a brother that I experience acceptance, that his truth isn't just words that I'm saying to myself, I'm actually experiencing it. And so now when those lies come about my value or identity that say I'm not good enough, I'm worthless, now I'm not just quoting another verse at it. I'm actually calling to mind uh, relational experiences where I have the opposite truth. And now that truth has the weight in my life that it needs to overcome the lies. So I think it's something we all need to be aware of, is just how easily, because you're spot on.
Yep.
Those lies are things we can speak to ourselves 1,000 times a day and not even really think about them being there. And so we have to be just as proactive to hearing and experiencing God's truth. And again, it needs to come in a relational way so that it has the power to really change our
Yeah.
thinking.
So I think another part of that too, and Nick, I'm glad you brought this up, because in my own mind right now, I'm making these connections where, when we read through the story of Scripture, there's 66 books in the canon of the Bible, and it's not necessarily a how-to manual. It's what the Germans called Hagistu. It's sacred history. It's a story. It's the experience that people have had with God, and it's this experiential God, the incarnate God. And how if we just live in a vacuum and we don't create new experiences in community, we can't rewrite and reprogram that limbic system, that inner
Yeah,
part, that fight, flight, or freeze, that I don't even have to think about it, below the cortex kind of a brain. And I think that's the reason that when we say we have to step into community, is we can't rewrite that limbic system or our hardwired way of thinking without new and fresh experiences, or we're just going to kind of go back. Would you
yep.
agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things we say in our workbooks and small group material is that addiction is an intimacy and attachment disorder. A lot of us think, oh, it's just porn, and I just like, beautiful women, or aren't all guys drawn to it? And sure, there's some brain chemical truth to that we're made with hormones and desires. But at a much deeper level, the reason we perpetuate a behavior that we want to change is always because of some deeper pain or wounds that haven't been addressed.
Sure.
And because that creates that intimacy and attachment disorder, what we're looking for in lust, sex, and pornography is false attachment, is
Right.
false belonging, is false or artificial ways to fulfill those deeper needs.
Right.
And that's where we have to invite God into those stories. And I really believe that only happens through community. It's
Sure.
as I'm telling my story with other men, and I'm understanding the ways that I was led to feel worthless, that then I can begin to hear and receive God's worth and value to, in a sense, not, we can't change our history, but
Yeah.
what we can do is we can change the lies that have gotten attached to our history. And if we
Yeah.
can hear God's worth and value for us in the very place we've been listening to lies, well, now our story can be told differently. That it's
Yeah.
that sense of, well, even though these things happened, here's what God has done, and here's who He says I am. And I'm choosing each day to live on that truth and not let myself be driven by the lies of my past or of my pain.
Well, I think that's what's so important, that we're talking about these two issues. We're talking about sexual purity and community. That's kind of the thrust of today's video,
Yeah.
in this episode. The willingness to put these together, obviously, acting out in sexual impurity, even through whether that's physical contact or pornography, are really symptoms. It's symptomatic behavior of an inward brokenness, and just
Absolutely.
quoting a
Yep.
scripture to it. Now, this is me as a pastor, and you've been a pastor, saying just quoting scripture at a hardwiring of the brain doesn't necessarily rewrite the brain. And I think Satan can quote scripture. Actually, he does.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
rational assent to something you've remembered doesn't rewire what is experientially ingrained. And that's why community is so important. And I think we to go back to something you said earlier, the pain to stay where we are. I think the other lie is the pain to change we think is greater,
Yeah.
and that's part of the other lie, is that the pain to change would be greater than the pain to stay where I'm at. And so I think these conversations are the doorsteps to get people to this place. Nick, if
Yeah.
someone wanted to know more about what you and I are talking about, where could they go to find out more about Pure Desire, and where would you direct them?
Yeah. And if I could just make a follow-up comment on what you
Oh yeah,
just
sure.
said,
Go ahead.
I would encourage as well. I think a lot of guys stay stuck because they think this is just the way it is. All guys struggle. You can't ever really be
Yeah.
free. You just got to do your best to manage it. So the other reason we don't change is we don't have a vision that the future could really be that much better. And that's something I would want to say as a man who's walked through this process and talks to people every day, finding freedom to say there is a future for you where you can be free of this, and it can be a wholly different relationship that you have with your wife and kids. It is worth it. And so if you can capture that vision of the future,
Right.
then you can say, well, it's worth whatever it would take to get there. So we'd love to be a part of that journey. They could visit us at puredesire.org is our website. We do a weekly podcast and a blog and have a lot of resources that are free under our resources tab. You could check that out. And then the main thing we'd like to do is help men get engaged in group in a healing process. And that's something we can help you do in your church with a group of men together. You guys could start a group yourselves,
Okay.
or we also have online groups that are led by trained, vetted facilitators that you could join from anywhere in the country. So a couple of options there to engage in group, and you can find all of our resources, and it's kind of the place to go is puredesire.org.
That's awesome. Well, Nick, I appreciate your willingness to come on and just, I know we could talk about this for a day,
Yes, we
but
could.
I think what I really wanted to do is to begin the conversation, let guys know, hey, let's talk about it. Let's at least kind of get it out there. And I appreciate what you guys are doing and all of your teams and for the ministry. And so we appreciate you being on today. And thanks for just sowing some wisdom into us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, bud.